everyone, to another episode of the Cosmic Matrix podcasts with your hosts Bernhard and Laura Matsu. Today's topic will be shadow work, triggers, and projections. And to dive right into it, I want to share a quote by Carl Gustav Jung, who has coined the term shadow work, or the shadow. And it goes as follows. The shadow describes the part of the psyche that an individual would rather not acknowledge. It contains the denied parts of the self. Since the self contains these aspects, they surface in one way or another. Bringing shadow material into consciousness drains its dark power, and can even recover valuable resources from it. The greatest power, however, comes from having accepted your shadow parts and integrated them as your components of yourself. Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. It all counts. It forms an unconscious snag, thwarting our most well-meaning intentions. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious.
Yeah, and as always, this is going to be the first hour, the podcast, which is going to be available public on iTunes and everywhere else. And we're going to continue on in a second hour, which is going to be just for members of the Piercing the Veil of Reality Forum. We also have a live Zoom call, which we're going to start hosting every month with Bernhard and I. And it's going to be, the next one's going to be a day after we release this podcast. So if you're listening to this on the day we released it, it's going to be on May 18th at 3 p.m. PST. And so it's going to be a live Zoom call. You can just click on a link and go in. And then if you can't make it at that time, we're also going to post the videos and all the videos for the live Zoom calls after. And we're just going to do Q&A, and then later on we're also going to go on specific topics and do them on themes. But this is just kind of the starter one, I guess you could say. And one more thing, we do have one spot left for a woman for our retreat June 3rd to 9th in Peru, in Tarapoto. So if you've been waiting to come, now's your opportunity. It's just kind of a last minute thing that opened due to some arrangements shifting around. So yes, please contact us by going to the Veil of Reality website, going to the Time of Transition retreat page, and then you can send an email there. So yeah, let's just get right into the topic. Did we want to talk more about the shadow and what is a shadow? I think you had a definition there as well. Does that correlate to what Carl Jung said?
Yeah, in general, does, in my own words, just talking about, I assume most people heard about the shadow work, projections, and triggers. It's a very, quote-unquote, popular topic in this day and age, and we want to dive a bit deeper into it. But generally speaking, the shadow, the shadow basically is the unconscious part and blind spot in your nature. We cannot really see it within ourselves, right? It's unconscious. That's the whole definition, that we're not aware of it. Excuse me. It is the opposite of the conscious ego, or what we identify ourselves or perceive as the I. And it constitutes the repressed negative recollections as well as the repressed positive potentialities in us. It is basically the dark side within us. And we see this in mythology. Actually, Joseph Campbell has talked about this a lot, that the shadow is most often represented as the monster that needs to be overcome and slayed. It's the dragon that comes up from the abyss and confronts you when you begin to move down into the unconscious, which is also symbolized by a cave or underworld in mythology. And it basically hides behind your persona, the personality mask you identify yourself with.
Yeah, and then let's talk a little bit about, there's 3 topics we're covering in this podcast, which are all interrelated. So shadow work, projections, and triggers. So the shadow is the unconscious aspect of ourselves and all of reality in general. It's not just individual. There's also a collective shadow, which we'll get into later. And then projections, which is what is unconscious in us tends to get projected outwards. I think you have a really good definition of this. And then being triggered, which is that unconscious being activated by some quote unquote external experience, meaning we can kind of go into that a bit later, but I feel personally, for the most part, a lot of the things that we experience externally are just aspects of what's going on with us internally, which is unconscious. So they kind of all, they all relate to each other in that way. So what do you feel is a projection?
Well, projection basically means, in terms of shadow projection, is we encounter our shadow, or we can almost identify our shadow when we project it on somebody else, interpersonally, or even a group or people or nations on a collective level. Right?
Yeah.
So basically, going back to Jung, according to Jung, the shadow is being instinctive and irrational, is prone to psychological projection, in which a perceived personal inferiority is recognized as perceived moral deficiency in someone else. Mm-hmm. So, and that what's also very important to keep in mind or to understand, that there are two kinds of projections: negative projections, also positive projections, which we mostly think of shadow projection only in negative terms, but not in positive terms. So, for example, negative projections, as most common, could be including strong emotions of hate, disgust, envy, jealousy, anger, irritation, and various other negative behaviors we see in others, and are strongly emotionally judge them for, or project them onto them.
Yeah.
And judge them for especially, but deny them within ourselves.
Yeah, we're judging them in other people because we've suppressed them within ourselves.
Exactly. That's the basic definition of projecting that, right? Because it's part of our unconscious selves, which we have repressed and are hidden in our own psyche. And when you project that onto another person, the negative, then we feel our ego personality feels better or superior or more moral, quote unquote, than the person we projected on.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, and then positive shadow projections, those are trickier because the ego will feed off of the positive shadow projection. So you and I get this a lot. It's like, and I've actually spotted them a bit better because I don't like that experience anymore. But when anyone like worships you and is like, oh my God, like, wow, and they just put this, they don't see you as being human. So like at any point in time, no matter how great a human is, they're also going to have this duality at play in them, like every single person. Like I feel there's no like perfect, pure human being. And even these quote unquote enlightened masters also have this integrated shadow, they know how to work with as well. So it's maybe more integrated. But when we, when we fall in love or when we really admire someone, we're only seeing these positive qualities in them. And I also notice with people I work with who really need to get work on their own self-esteem and work on their own empowerment, what they do is they project onto like me or other people around them all these positive qualities which they themselves has not claimed.
Exactly. That's really what comes down to positive projections. Like you mentioned, include worship, admiration. When we put a person on a pedestal, pedestal or pedestal? How do
pedestal.
I pronounce it?
Well,
pedestal.
I don't know. The German way is maybe pedestal.
And only see quote unquote good in them. Like you mentioned, especially that's very common in the romantic phase, the beginning phase of a relationship, when you project all these positive qualities in a partner until the shadow comes up at some point in the relationship. And always see it in the cult of celebrity, right? Rock stars, gurus, anyone who is famous, so we project all these qualities onto them. But as you mentioned, it constitutes our own positive unconscious potential project onto others. So in a sense, we're diminishing ourselves when we engage in positive projection.
Yeah, and we do that, like the celebrities is a good example. And this is also why, even though for a person with low self-esteem, positive shadow projections could feel elated, like make them feel elated at first, is because the positive shadow projections, once you don't live up to that expectation that they've created in their mind about you, they're only going to take you down. And then you see that in celebrity gossip magazines, people are like worshiping these celebrities, that they're always looking for shit that's wrong in their personal lives or things that they did, they're trying to egg them on. Like Justin Bieber, for instance, they see him as being this big pop star, and yet they walk around, like the paparazzi walk around him, like harassing him, trying to get him to act out because they want to present an image of perfection, then they want to take it down.
I mean, that's almost on the basic official mainstream culture, almost the the mechanism of putting somebody up, raising up to pedestal, only to tear them down to make themselves feel better again.
Exactly. And that's why I feel like for me, like the negative shadow projections are a bit easier to deal with in that sense. And I find that interestingly, the positive shadow projections can get to be way more vicious because they try to push you up somewhere so they can tear you down. So it's like this weird mind fuck.
I've experienced it in my own work here and there.
Yeah.
First of all, it's also, it feels uncomfortable actually.
Yeah, it doesn't.
Because,
unless you're
more
wounded.
Narcissistic, the wounded have more narcissistic tendencies, the ego definitely feeds off of the positive projections.
Yeah.
Right? And all that. But I had incidences like even just recently, something I wrote, and I got the angry message from somebody who was just following my work for all these years and blah, blah, and then get this message. I thought, I just read what you wrote. I thought, you were just this leader and blah, blah, blah. And was very disappointed about a certain point of view I had.
What was the point of view?
It was just just in general about, we talked about diet, that whole vegan
they
topic.
got triggered by the veganism?
Vegan topic,
Okay.
related to your recent article.
Oh, really?
Right?
That's funny.
So got all project, and all these, even in her own words, I thought you were this and this, exposing the projections she had.
She private messaged you on Facebook?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And then, just basically, I'm unfollowing you now, because her projections of who she thought I was didn't match, was not based on reality.
But you were never a vegan never.
Yeah,
but
it's just an example.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter, right?
Yeah.
Of just one little thing that basically triggered her.
Yeah.
Right. And then having had this, I don't know, image of me, of whatever.
And then an image on top of that overlaid of a spiritual person having to be vegan.
Yeah, exactly. So
yeah.
Anyway, there are many other examples I can recall from my own work, because I, with my own work, similar to yours, I talk about quote unquote taboo topics, and people can get easily triggered.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
And then they project. That's a whole topic in itself, in shadow projection terms. When you talk about certain topics that challenge somebody's ingrained beliefs, then they personally attack you for it.
Yeah.
Right? The cognitive dissonance, they cannot even engage in a rational argument about the topic itself. They're so triggered that then they attack you personally for it.
So what part of their shadow do you think is because I'm trying to just make an example of the correlation between the shadow, the projections, and being triggered. So what part of their shadow do you think it's triggered by when you find a belief that challenges yours? Do you think it's maybe the, what's the word, when you're overly focused on a single point of view?
When you're very identified with a belief in a certain point of view.
Yeah,
your personality is you're that, So if you attack that point of view, it feels like a personal attack.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
right?
yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I think that's also one thing too that's maybe we can just touch on part of, I realize this is a lesson that I've come to because I also tend to get very intensely obsessed in anything that I'm studying, And then if someone presents a different perspective or a different path, I can feel this feeling in myself where I want to almost protect and defend what I believe in and but what the mechanism that I have to do is I have to also let my, conscious mind override it. I think this is also a tribal survival mechanism as well. We want to find safety in people who have the same beliefs as us. But what I'll do is I'll feel this desire to defend and protect myself just because someone has a different belief or a different path than I do, because once we find something that works for us, we always want to think that that's the one right way. And this is the best thing ever, not realizing we're all on a different soul journey. It's all so multifaceted that who are we to know who are we to even know what's the best for us, at any point in time. So I think that's the trap in general is when we find something that resonates with us to also be and this is also the main divide between religion and politics and nations is thinking that your way of living is the right way and that everyone needs to assimilate to that, not really willing to accept the diversity of the human soul and its journey that it has to go on.
Yeah, we can even take that as an example on a more collective or national level, talking about triggers and shadow projection with what's happening nowadays in the political realm with regards to the left versus the right, especially Donald Trump, right? He's the greatest teacher out there somewhere right now, so to speak, because the amount of projections he's receiving, the amount of people getting triggered by him, especially the left. Remember when, I even wrote an article about it, Donald Trump and the shadow of America. When he first got elected, how all the left, the Democrats got like their shadow come out like an ugly monster, and they, burning posters of him or puppets of him, like engaging things they were actually spoke out against, right, and projecting this hate and anger towards men based on fear, right, and coming from this more moral high ground that they are better and whatnot, and he's this disgusting man, not understanding basic psychology. Even Gabor Mate talked about this as well in a recent interview when he talked about the denial of America. Very interesting interview. I can highly recommend to watch that on YouTube. We also talked about similar what I mentioned, that Donald Trump also embodies like the American shadow, right? The bigger, the better, the self-made millionaire, right? The quantity of equality, all of that, narcissism. That's like the American shadow, the best, country in the world.
The only
I can do and be anyone.
I feel like Kim Kardashian would be an excellent candidate for president next as a representative.
I mean, that's just a very basic example of just shadow projection and triggers on the political level.
But then also, like, I think that the thing is, as well, is, all the shadows of the left is coming to light. But I don't know, because I don't really hang out with like people who are very politically opinionated or active for a reason. But is it helping them? You know what I mean? Like, are they actually, because we can get triggered a lot and we can have somebody who's like around us, who's triggering us nonstop. But as long as we're blaming and we're not actually addressing what's going on internally, it's just creating this friction, in the atmosphere. I think that's the question to ask. And also, we also have this rise of, this is where I think the quote, I don't know the etymology of the term being triggered, but I know that it was very popularized in this NPC kind of overly politically correct culture. That's where it rose to popularity, and it rose to popularity around this culture of avoiding triggering people. Like, I remember like back in like Tumblr, which is like a social media place, it's different than Facebook. It was like whenever they had a post about like sexual abuse or anything, actually, it started getting way out of hand. But originally it started being, we would put trigger warning and then they would put content below, which is understandable. I think, there is some truth in like, if you've gone through, in like for me, you've seen me get triggered. Like, I've gone through experiences of sexual abuse. So I'm not going to intentionally watch a film where there's going to be an abuse scene or any sort of rape in general. Even if I didn't have those experiences, I think at my certain level of being, I wouldn't want to engage in watching stuff like that because I wouldn't see the point of like traumatizing myself. But I think there's a use to, like, trying to avoid certain triggers because you don't want to cause more work for yourself. Same as like, you can use this to an extreme justifiably. So say I've seen people do this, especially in the new age. They'll get into a relationship with the wrong person who will just like really like hurt them, and they'll use it as a process for shadow work. And like, you could get involved in a relationship with a sociopath and you can have like endless amount of content, but is that really like a wise, is that a wise investment of your energy? Like, why not just leave the relationship? So there's like kind of that side of the coin too. So it's like, we want to, I feel, welcome triggers as an opportunity to learn about ourselves, but yet also have, like know the difference, I guess, between a trigger. This is a key difference. It's like a trigger, which is like something emotionally in us that needs to be processed. And then also, like, we are humans who like also have these animal instincts of like anger and disgust. And some of these are natural instincts to protect ourselves. You know what I mean? So like if somebody, for instance, like if I'm out in public and someone touches my ass and then I get angry, I'm not going to be like, why am I not comfortable with them doing that? I'm going to see that anger as a defense mechanism to protect me from, like being harmed. So then there's a tricky thing. And I think that that's why it really takes this level of objectivity, self-awareness, also having people that we can reflect back upon and get feedback from. Like, there's so many different layers to it.
Yeah, you touch upon exactly, and a very important point. Also ties a bit into the limitations of shadow work, or just the tunnel vision or misapplication, more or less, of shadow work. You know, people can indulge in it as well, and not understanding how the work really is about, to transmuting, you know, to come to a high level of being, to more objectivity, to more integrated, you know, taking responsibility for the way you feel. But also, it's also oversimplified in the New Age or pop spirituality, where by sayings like, when you spot it, you got it. You know what I mean? Or everything what you see in another person is just your projection, which comes through a subjective filter, obviously, on some level.
Yeah.
But there's also a place where we can see what's going on in another person clearly without that being our own stuff.
And
right?
It can be both, too.
It can be both, too.
That's
exactly.
the tricky thing.
If you can actually own it,
Yeah.
you know, you can see something in another person because you have this dealing with the same shit, so to speak.
Yeah.
So that comes more from an honest place as well.
Yeah.
But sometimes certain things you can perceive another person, which is not necessarily, you have come more, not necessarily your own stuff, because you have come more to an objective place. I mean, that's the whole point of deeper esoteric spiritual work, to rise to a high level of objectivity within yourself and the world. Right? So that's, you know, that's why, you know, especially when you work with people, you know, how you can give them feedback, a mirror, like you mentioned. It's very important in this aspect of shadow work in general to get feedback from other people, because we have all our blind spots. But that can be tricky as well, right?
Yeah.
Because you don't want to get feedback from just everyone, because that's mostly, especially people you don't know personally, that's mostly just filled by projections.
Yeah.
You know, sometimes there can be truth in it, but mostly it's filled with projections.
Yeah, yeah.
But you want to like get feedback from people who are also engaged, first of all, in the same work, are aware of shadow triggers projection, and can point out your blind spot, which sometimes, excuse me, on the receiving end, doesn't always feel good, right? Because the ego can come in, like, doesn't want to admit certain things, and sometimes to own certain aspects, quote unquote negative shadow aspects, doesn't always feel good. Right.
Yeah, and it also depends. Like, I think giving feedback is like an art in itself.
That's true.
Like, I think one thing, because we're so used, many of us, I think we deal with this like intense inner critic, and we deal with the critic of the environment. We also live in a culture which collectively shames and criticizes one another. So there's some ways around that. And what I've learned actually from Gabor Mate's work, and I mean, in which he learned from other psychologists and other work he's done, is it's about creating this element of safety and attunement, and then also asking the person if they want the feedback to begin with. You know what? And that's
Very
the thing.
important.
And like, and a lot of times I see, you know, I've been around people in quote unquote spiritual circles who have, you know, they have this perception where they're able to see things. And I wrote about this on Facebook about giving feedback, you know, is that like, and some people disagreed with me, but a fundamental element of giving feedback is this kindness and compassion. Like, that's showing that you're coming from a good place, and not just being like, so you can spot whatever people's blind spots is. That's actually not that hard, you know, once you reach a certain level of like awareness, I feel, to spot what other people's blind spots are. But the only way that you can really help them is if you attune to them, if you see whatever behavior pattern is covering up, and being able to handle it sensitively. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I can even reflect on myself. I can totally own that in the past I've given feedback even to close friends without being asked. Right.
Yeah.
Just because it was so clear, like I just blurted out, and it was not helping. The person shut down even more.
Yeah.
Or became very defensive. Even if it was the truth, it doesn't matter. But it was like my approach didn't help.
Yeah.
Right. So very important, you know, it's asking for permission. Like, hey, do you mind? Can I give you some feedback? I see something. And then, you know, there needs to be the permission. Right?
Yeah.
And then how we come across as well, creating that safety space. In the sense, also it's context and situation. It depends, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes, like, about calling people out, it depends. Sometimes we need to make a stand and make a boundary, right? Or, you know, if it's more a subtle form of projection or trigger, then we can engage in a more compassionate approach, obviously.
Yeah.
Without falling into blind compassion again and all that.
Exactly. So let's talk a little bit more about these shadow projections that we do put upon the world and other people. and how they can help us learn about ourselves. Like I know for myself, like, I mean, I can just give examples. I definitely, because I think Canada is interesting because Canada is like not anymore, it's maybe slightly, but I would say arguably, but not any more politically advanced than America, but yet we project, like Canada is like a NPC nation basically. And we project a lot of shadow projections upon America, which I also do as well. You know, like Canada has definitely, and especially like upper middle class liberal Canadians have this sense of superiority above Americans because, you know, like American is like the lowest of the low culturally. Canada also engages the exact same things, but I can see how collectively I also have a shadow, which which gets triggered about America as a country, even though that's like a vague concept, you know? And then also upon other people, I notice like, you know, like anything, like my main thing is it's gotten way, way, way better. But I think the dominant emotion that shows that I'm projecting upon another person is getting annoyed. Like, and underneath the annoyance, I've done like kind of inquiry on this, is usually anger. And then underneath anger is usually sadness. But that takes some ability to first observe that I'm being annoyed to begin with. So recognize the emotion in me. And then it also takes some ability to be present with that without acting out. And like annoyance is a weird thing because it's such a jumpy emotion, you know, and it automatically, this is also the thing with being triggered, is it's usually an emotion that wants to get us out of our body. And that's why we project upon another person, because it's not a comfortable, I guarantee you for the majority of the time, like 99.999% of the time, anytime we're triggered, it's not a comfortable emotion to sit with, which is why we get out of body and we project upon other people. So that's just an example. We have projections we put upon the world. It's myself. Just one more example is, you know, especially, and I think this is quite common for women who have experiences of sexual abuse, is they project upon the world an unsafe world where there maybe is safety because they actually don't feel safe in themselves. And that's something I've worked on quite a bit, but it's still something I have to still work on, you know, and by projecting on the world this layer, which, you know, we make relate to all of reality, we actually don't have that ability to be objective as well.
Yeah. So in a sense, also shadow projection relates to our own wounds and trauma.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, obviously. But I can relate in these more subtle, you know, triggers I get also. You know, like you mentioned, I can only get triggered or annoyed by certain people or by people who like don't get certain things or just stupidity.
Yeah.
Right. But then the self-reflection is like, yeah, it's also because my own stupidity in the sense of, or in the sense of being very hard on myself, unconsciously having high standards I put onto others.
It's your inner critic.
So it's also like, because I have also this, you know, I can see how my shadow gets activated if I identify with a certain ideal self-image, right? Or projected that standards others should be living up to, or I should be living up to. So I project my own stuff, my own standards onto others. Yeah. And then it's not really coming from a compassionate place. Yeah. Because I know at regular is actually I lack compassion towards myself. Right? Yeah. Hence the anger.
Exactly.
Coming up. Right?
Yeah. Where do you think that comes from?
Well, partly maybe my German uprising.
But were your parents, like, they projected an idealized self-image on you?
Yeah, that's very true because, you know, in my own life, you know, like in my generation anyway, like, you know, my dad even like suggested, you know, certain professions I should get into.
Yeah, my
parents university,
did that
like
too,
they already had an image of me of what I should be doing, which was
yeah.
not in line with who I truly am. So I didn't feel seen. Yeah. Right. Yeah, that happens a lot.
Yeah,
right?
super common. Yeah, exactly. So, like, how can we identify, or like, how do you identify when it's a shadow projection and when it's just an observation?
I think the big difference that ties into like the nature of a trigger. Right. So a trigger is really when we quote unquote overreact emotionally, right? With something that really affects us on an emotional level or even a physiological level. You can sense it in your body, on your mind. It goes over and over, and it really like is overly focused on whatever that person, the incident is doing,
Yeah.
right? And the judgments come up right away,
Yeah.
right? But mostly is, a hint at your own shadow is when you really have a strong emotional reaction to something, quote unquote, negative emotional
compared
reaction.
to what the event actually was.
And now, exactly. And then having more an objective observation, which could be the truth without your own stuff involved, is more like a sober recognition that doesn't affect you on any shape or form.
Well, I mean, it can affect you. Like, for instance, the example I used earlier, if someone, crosses your physical boundaries, but what I would say is a difference between it could be both at once. Like, we could also have an objective. I've had this happen. I had this like objective perspective, but then I got triggered by what I saw. So it can be both, like if I see someone who is like hurting a child, obviously I'm going to have a response to that, like a human response where I'm going to want to, stop it or help them, or have some sort of reaction that's going to be, as somebody's fairly empathic, I'll be able to feel the pain of the situation. But yet if I have a, history of childhood abuse and then I get triggered by that, like, you see how it can be both at once? Exactly.
I mean, that reminds me of something I can share where I realized my own shadow came out, being triggered by somebody. I used to work at this many years ago. That was like 10 years ago at this retreat center as a massage therapist. And there was another massage therapist who also taught yoga there. And he had this all like retreats going and all of that. And he was just very good, promoting his work and, getting clients, and used this, even the retreat center to get more clients for his retreats and all of that. It was kind of schmoozing, like in a sense, using that center to advance his own business. And it really triggered me, right? I felt like, oh my, he's being so fake, with just trying to, use it to promote his own work and all of that. And it really annoyed me, right? Even found myself talking shit about him to another friend. But then I realized, why is it, why do I care? I don't even know this guy personally, right? And he may be indeed like, who care, maybe acting out of integrity, but it just triggered me emotionally a lot. Like it was very, I was very annoyed by it, and I judged him harshly. So then got into deeper self-inquiry, and what it came out that I actually was not happy where I was at, right? And actually that projection was fueled by jealousy and envy.
Yeah.
On some level, right? That I'm actually still stuck at this place when I would actually unconsciously would like to do more, expand my work like he did and whatnot. Maybe obviously not in the same way, but I was just projecting my own lack of self-worth onto that person.
Yeah, that's a really common one. Yeah. I would say for most people, they get triggered. Like, that's why, like, this is a really common thing when people actually like start pursuing their quote unquote dreams and true purpose, is a lot of people who are fairly unconscious to their own shadow of their own unrealized dreams, which is a lot of people because they were taught to like go to university at 18, go into whatever interested them at the time, and they kind of got stuck in a job which just doesn't truly resonate with them. And I've noticed this is like a common theme for anyone who starts truly like living in alignment with their purpose, which is not something that was really common in previous decades. You know what I mean? And then everyone around them who's not doing that gets triggered by their unrealized potential, basically. Yeah.
Well, how about we go a bit deeper into spotting certain triggers, because it's just beyond the emotional reaction. What's also important to point out, there's also a physiological reaction in the body.
Yeah, that's Reggie Ray talks about how the unconscious is actually all in the body. Like all of your past lives, all of your suppressed emotions, it's all in the body. So the unconscious is the body. And if you look at it, like considering how like disembodied we are, like if people haven't listened to previous podcasts, we live in a very like head-centric reality where people are cut off from the wisdom of their body and their more feminine, intuitive nature. And so what gets triggered and why we have such a strong reaction, and actually, interestingly, getting triggered does automatically make us a bit more embodied in that exact moment, because it shows us a pain that's happening within us that was there, that becomes conscious for a moment, and then if we project outwards, we get out of body again. But in the moment of being triggered, it actually can, it brings us into the present, it brings us into our body, because normally we were out somewhere else, you know what I mean?
So it's basically a chance for healing.
Exactly.
For deeper inquiry, right? To
Yeah.
tune into what's actually happening.
Yeah.
But, the nature of getting triggered and then projecting it onto externally is actually a way to buffer up to avoid feeling.
Yeah.
Right? To avoid the pain, and it makes yourself feel better by projecting it externally. Right?
Yeah, it makes you feel better temporarily, but it's like the emotional content is already there. So maybe we can talk about, how in our own lives we process triggers. I think, you and I, we obviously trigger each other, but we've gotten a lot better in dealing with it, I think.
Yeah, I think the most important part in anything, be it intimate relationships, anything when the trigger comes up, is also honoring the quote-unquote psychological rule that you cannot make somebody else responsible for the way you feel.
Yeah, yeah.
To not fall into the blame thing.
Yeah, because then you're
right.
depending on the other person or external conditions to change, which are way out of your control, in order for you to feel better. And that's the whole kind of NPC culture that they're making. Is like, let's make the world a certain way so that they don't trigger this certain group of people.
So nobody gets offended anymore.
Yeah, exactly. And then it ends up oppressing people, and they're like, oh, whatever, we're just trying to oppress the racist, the misogynist, etc. Which is, yeah, that's true. That's who kind of they're targeting, but they're also, it becomes this, policing of what people can and cannot say, and it tends to fall into more extremist views, So if you say anything that's even close to having an alternate opinion to feminism, is going to be your own internalized misogyny, and then it just spirals from there,
Yeah, it's like ties into the divide and conquer frequency of the matrix, which we can talk about this from the occult perspective in the second part a bit.
Yeah, but let's get back on topic. Yeah, so
I want to share about what you just mentioned. In our relationship, any relationship, sometimes conflict comes up. Sometimes we get triggered, you get triggered, right? And sometimes we just engage maybe into the blame game a little bit, and I feel because you have done this, and or defense and all of that. But then once we remember and apply what we talk about ourselves, I remember this one incident. I got really triggered by something. We had a little conflict, and I felt this anger and frustration coming up, right? But then I noticed, I remember you also helped me to guide into what's happening in your body? How do you feel? That's, I feel, a very important aspect, to not even consider the emotion first, but the physical sensation in the body.
Yeah, that's the reason why they do that, is because in trauma therapy, a lot of feelings that cause the original trauma were pre-verbal.
Exactly. And so in that instance, it's also about getting out of the mind, not because the mind right away wants to justify, analyze, give a reason.
Yeah.
Well, I'm feeling this because of this, that,
story.
and it's or we look up what's going on in astrology today. Just something needs to be justified or blamed for it.
Yeah.
But when in that instance, when I was just, it gets where somatic meditation comes into hand, like body scanning, to sit with it. And I was feeling especially there was tension in my chest, solar plexus, like this contraction, right? And really feeling into it without analyzing it, without judging it as good or bad, and also without trying to change it. And really just feeling it. And then I felt just the physical sensation of this contraction in my chest. And then you activate, you get out of your head and you activate, some magic happens in your body, in their soma, the body intelligence almost kicks in, or something deeper on a spiritual level. You can say your true self, your essence comes through anything, helping you to work through it. And then you feel like these layers dissolving almost. It's hard to put into words, feeling into the physical sensation. All of a sudden you sense this emotion of just anger, frustration, irritation, but then you go deeper and all of a sudden felt this sadness coming up, right? This loneliness, or just, even some sort of betrayal or whatnot. And all of a sudden I started crying, right? It just came out, and it was, just in a sense, it was actually a great release. Some deep pain came up that needed to release itself. And in that moment, I also realized it had nothing to do with whatever reason of the conflict we got into. It had nothing to do with you at all. But in that instant, it related actually classically to something with my mother.
Yeah.
As a young child, right? That got reactivated triggered in that moment. So in that instance, you can use it as a chance for healing for deeper childhood wounds on the most basic level.
Exactly.
Right? By allowing yourself to feel first the physical sensation and then the emotion that comes up, which for some people it's not that easy. Right? We want to point that out as well, like especially if some people are living most of the time in their heads, dissociated. They've built up so much armor, so much defense mechanisms. So it's even very hard for people just to feel these sensations in the body, and it becomes so reactive to distract from it.
Yeah, that's why I think it's probably extremely crucial for anyone who practices meditation to be doing, again, I'm saying my way is the best way, but from my experience, it's called quote unquote Vipassana, which by the way just means insight meditation, but how we translate Vipassana is like doing these kind of body scanning, pay attention to the sensitivity of the body, starting from the feet. I'd start from the feet out. Some people start from the crown down, but you just scan all the layers of your body. And a lot of the times when you start doing this, you think it's numb. Like you're like, oh, I can't feel my feet. I can't feel my thighs or whatever. And then slowly, as you put your awareness there, the cells almost start to wake up through our own conscious attention. And I think that's really what it means to like make the darkness conscious. Cause you had this pain in your chest. By putting your own awareness on that, you're making it conscious because you're becoming conscious of what's there. You're putting your presence there. And then that's the thing is a lot of feelings because maybe when you were a child, you weren't actually able to express and to feel those feelings. So they became suppressed and then they get activated later. And later, in order to resolve it, you almost need to let the emotions play themselves out, be felt, as if so say if that experience, if that something happened with you and a child and your mother was actually able to be held by your mother and she was able to be emotionally there and process with you, it wouldn't become unconscious because you were able to express it, you're able to feel into it, you're able to run it through to its completion. But it's because we live in this culture and a lot of us live in families where we're not allowed to emotionally, I'm saying this majority, I'm sure that not some people were lucky enough to have a different setup, but we're not able to express our emotions openly. We don't have anyone who safely can hold those emotions for us. That's what ends up suppressing a lot of these emotions into our unconscious. And then later, as our adult selves, we can learn how to hold those emotions with our own presence and our own awareness, recognize what's there, recognize the pain that's there, and allow them to play themselves out to their completion. And by giving ourselves that presence that maybe we didn't get, previously.
Exactly. So the really key aspect is really also to understand, to get into the physical sensation of the body, right?
Yeah.
And feeling that, because that, in a sense, any unprocessed experience is held in the body somewhere.
Yeah.
Right? That's really what it comes down to. It relates to also what we talked about, I think in the previous one of the past podcasts about karma, quote unquote, in the body of unprocessed experiences. But, also generally speaking, let's talk a bit, I want to just bring this up, social media, Facebook, whatever it may be, because, people get triggered on the left and right, or even politically or anything, what we see, what some person posts, their pics, her pics, whatever.
Yeah.
Excuse me. Some, many of us, we judge very easily, we can get triggered, I can get triggered, but it's ironically and places like Facebook or social media, actually a great place to practice shadow work in that
That's
sense,
true.
or do deeper spiritual esoteric work as well, to check yourself, when a trigger arises, why am I getting triggered? Right? What's really happening?
Yeah.
And without automatically projecting externally, to observe yourself, your reactions to certain posts, pics, and whatnot, and own these feelings.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah. The majority of people will just end up creating a straw man argument on their post and be like, yeah, exactly. And that's why, and it's interesting. I was just thinking as you were saying that the reason why, these triggers can come up is because for the most part, when people are out in the world, from what I've seen, is they're checked out. They're out of body to some degree, not entirely. So, it takes something really big for them to trigger. Like they've checked out because reality and the society as it's set up, from my own opinion and from what I've seen, is too traumatic for them to actually be embodied within it. But then interestingly, Facebook has become this quote unquote weird safe space for people, but it's not true, because they go on there to relax, to share with friends or whatever. But the reality which ends up happening is they end up getting triggered. But the reason they get triggered so much is because a lot of people perceive it and go to it as a safe space, as an escape, you know? So that's the interesting component to that, is like the reason they're able to get triggered so much is because they're going there to like relax. Same with me. That's why I actually make sure, like, I mean, I don't do this all the time, but really early in the morning when I'm like waking out of that sleep space, most of the time, you know, I try to meditate first thing when I get up. I don't go on any social media, don't check any email, because I know that this is a really, you know, I want to start my day right, but then I also know this is a really fragile space for me, and I know how Facebook is, you know, and especially with you and I, like, because not only are we, you know, going through our own process, I actually don't have like a lot of time to go through the feed. Like, and if I do, I spend so little time on there liking stuff that the feed doesn't even know who I am anymore. So it's not interesting for me. But what mainly I deal with now, depending, but a lot of people will add me because I like share a lot of the conventional kind of like feel good writing, and then I'll share something, you know, about like exposing like the pedophile rings or something, and then that ends up triggering people, and that's because of these positive shadow projections. Maybe we can talk more about that.
What we just talked about at the beginning with this
exactly
image people project.
Exactly, these positive shadow projections. So what's more happening for me is like I'm having to deal with the triggers from other people, and interestingly then this triggers my own stuff about like wanting to make people happy and being like a people pleaser or whatever, you know. But the more that you're also able to spot when somebody else is triggered, and then you're also able to hold that space for them, even from your own awareness, I feel like, not, you know, like pointing out why they got triggered and giving your own analysis, but just being able to respond compassionately and seeing, okay, this person's had something in them that got activated. Like, how am I going to treat this person who's most likely reverted to like a place of their child self? You know what I mean? Like, I think looking at it that way, not trying to point out to them like, oh, this is why you got triggered, this is like what I know about you, but being like, okay, how is this person feeling? Like, do I want to engage in their process? Do I feel like they're interested in that? And like, how am I going to treat this? And is it even worth it? Like, for the most part, to be honest, like I already have so much work to do every single day, which I kind of overload myself with, that people getting triggered on Facebook is a super low priority for me. You know, like if they don't like what I post, they can unfriend me. I'm fine with that, you know, but this is also another thing, is like, I think we need to be careful, because we can use Facebook, we can use a lot of situations for gaining higher levels of self-awareness, but is a good use of our time is the question.
Exactly. That's, you know, I'm not implying, okay, let's spend more time on Facebook to do shadow work.
Yeah.
It's just generally to understand, you know, like that it's a chance always, whatever you get triggered by, post or pics, to examine why you're triggered without projecting externally and reactively and mechanically, which is not easy.
Yeah.
Right. And if you do this really, truly, sincerely, excuse me, you will actually realize that the why has nothing to do with the triggered self nor the other person we projected upon, but it actually relates more to your own unprocessed wounds, also related to unconscious shame, guilt, grief, unprocessed anger, lack of self-worth, jealousy, envy, and so on and so forth, right? So it's also owning these emotions and feeling them, right, which entails going deep into your body. But that reminds me also of something else we should address. We talked about being triggered in terms of an overly emotional reaction, mechanically. But there's also, you know, it's all about the idea of staying in 0 point, right, and observing. But that can also be easily misapplied, right? Yeah. Because you can also suppress the emotions.
Yeah, that's what that's the whole thing, is like, I've noticed, because, and this is one thing that I think is really fundamental if you have any sort of trauma in the background, and this is what I've been reading in Peter Levine's work, that one of the crucial elements of healing this trauma is noticing when you check out. If you can start noticing that, then that's really important, because most people check out and don't even realize that. That's what happened to me. And you saw what happened sometimes when I checked out. And we talked about, we're going to go deeper into like occult forces and stuff in the second hour, and how that's also something I was going to note about Facebook, is like these occult forces who feed off of this drama and emotional energy it's a feeding ground for them on Facebook.
Exactly. So we definitely go deeper into that topic in the second hour about occult forces, hyperdimensional attack, interferences, and how this relates to shadow projection, working through other people, or even working through our own minds when we get activated. What you were saying about the this kind of this, when we think we're not being triggered, but we're in this fake non-reactive consciousness. I think we'll go in more detail on that in the second podcast. That's a lot to talk about, I feel, Yeah. But I mean, just to bring it down, like sometimes just because, what I want to mention about fake non-reactive consciousness is when you're actually going into your head and disembodied, and you don't acknowledge feelings, because non-reactive consciousness, or being 0 point, doesn't mean
doesn't mean you don't feel things.
Doesn't mean you don't feel it. Doesn't mean to resist or deny feelings. Yeah. Right?
They flow through you like they're supposed to. Yeah.
Exactly. You're just able to hold the space without projecting it externally.
Yeah. Or, like like how to flow with the emotional dynamics of a situation. Like fight or flight exists for a reason. However, most people are in fight or flight all the time, that they actually can't use it wisely. You know what I mean?
Yeah, you can see, for example, let's say, generally speaking, our last podcast was about the New Age, and we talked about, some of the New Age fallacies of anger is bad, right? Mm-hmm. So a lot of, anger has its place, especially, it's a necessary emotion to make your boundaries clear sometimes when they have been severely crossed. Yeah. Right? But a lot of people deny anger, don't want to appear angry. So when they get triggered in some way, it creates this fake niceness, this fake nice personality. Mm-hmm. And the anger comes more through like stingy, passive aggressiveness. Yeah. Right? Yeah, that's common. So they're still triggered, even though it doesn't appear over emotionally that way.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, a really important point, I know this will be triggering for people, is we're usually only triggered when we hold a belief in ourselves that feels the same way. You know what I mean? So if somebody says to us that, like, if I said to you, you're lazy, and you actually had a belief in yourself deep down inside that you are a lazy person, that's going to trigger you. But if I say you're lazy to you and you don't actually hold that belief, that's not going to trigger you.
That's a very important point. That's a very good point.
Yeah. So that's why and that's how we can also help us gain our own self-awareness on these, beliefs that we hold about ourselves. And this is also the thing, like whether or not the belief is true, even if it is true that you're a lazy person, who cares? Like at the end of the day, maybe that's just like whatever, but it's about you resisting that aspect of yourself, resisting whatever it is that, laziness is doing for you. It's that leaves it unexplored and unconscious in you.
Yeah, exactly. And it is unconscious. That's why you may not recognize it right away. Yeah. But the fact that you emotionally react to it so strongly means there's some resonance to that, to your own internal belief system, which could also be something you picked up in childhood or something that was told to you, like by your parents, for example. Yeah. And you've internalized it and shoved into the unconscious, repressed, and now project onto others, or when others tell you that, you react disproportionately. So there's something, and it's a chance again for healing, a chance for self-inquiry, for self-observation in light of the basic inner psychological work and basic spiritual work, self-work in general, right? It's always an opportunity to deal with these emotions as they come up when you're triggered.
Yeah, and I like this analogy from Gabor, I forget how you say that. Anyway, I like this analogy, and I'm not sure if this is his. You said you've heard it before, but he talks about the trigger and ammunition analogy. So if you think about the trigger, it's only a small part of the gun. What really explodes is the ammunition. And he references the ammunition as being this unexplored emotional content that we're holding within ourselves. And that's actually what is explosive. It's not the trigger itself. The trigger is just, the trigger can go off, and then we have no ammunition. There's going to be no emotional content. So it's about really exploring that emotional content and what we're holding inside of ourselves. Like I've noticed, like, for myself, like I still have to work on this. Like, you know, like there's this anger that I feel needs an outlet, which I know is related to, like, you know, experiences of abuse where I should have gotten angry at the moment to being like, gross, like, don't do that to me or whatever. That's the ammunition that's still being held within me. And I noticed just like in myself, like when I get like annoyed with people, that the anger is the first thing that comes up, and then it's the sadness underneath it. So that's something that I still need to, you know, discharge, and I discharge it through my own awareness. You know, like I've noticed, especially I would say almost every single meditation that I have lately, at least, you know, because I've been exploring and a lot of like old traumas have been coming up. There's some really uncomfortable emotion that comes up and my mind automatically wants to stop the meditation. It starts going elsewhere. It starts getting out of body because it's so strong. And if I can teach myself to just be with it, like some magic happens, like there's a transmutation happening. And then interestingly, you know, like more stuff rises from the unconscious, some more space that we create within ourselves. So it's this ongoing process. I don't think there's ever a point, you know, maybe there's a point when it gets easier for sure and it doesn't get as intense, but we're going to be processing things all the time and making it conscious, I feel.
I think what's very important, two things that came up, remind me of what you said, of this really great analogy between the trigger and ammunition. That's about the ammunition, the emotional load behind it.
Yeah.
That most often I can see myself, if you're not aware of this process or don't apply shadow work, we just focus on the trigger and justify the trigger.
Yeah.
We justify it. Well, you said this, so I, you know, of course I'm triggered because you said this or you did this. So we justify the trigger. So that's kind of like, you know, it will not go anywhere, right? We're just falling into blame victim trap, so to speak.
Yeah, I feel like that's a distortion of like we're justifying it because that's a distortion of like a common human survival mechanism that I was like pointing to earlier. So like, you know, like if someone does something that doesn't feel that crosses your boundary where anger is justified, you know, that's why it's so tricky, because you can also use that as a distortion to justify things that aren't necessarily to be angry about. Like, you know, the thing I was talking, the analogy I said earlier about the guy just touching someone, you know, and then the anger being justified to being like, get off me, you know, but then there's also, I feel there's these quote unquote healthy defense mechanisms, which I would say the majority of people don't have access to because they have the unhealthy defense mechanisms that are filtering their reality. You know, like you actually, I feel personally, you can't execute fight or flight with the higher wisdom that it contains, since we live in a culture where people are constantly in fight or flight. Yeah. Like we're really especially from the media, the political sphere, we're in this space where it's like just trying to make people fearful, angry, hateful. You know, it's working against us developing this higher wisdom. And I think that's it's not going to happen just naturally for us. We're going to have to make the conscious effort to work on it ourselves in our individual lives in order to rise above that. Like, we just fall in line with the masses and do whatever it is they're doing. They're just going to keep feeding off of this emotional.
Exactly. And that ties into, which we also, since we're nearing almost the end of the first hour, what I want to talk about in the second hour, also the limitations of shadow work. You know, people are just stuck in this tunnel vision that everything is our shadow, everything needs to be integrated. And it's like you said, you just mentioned, you just go deeper and there are layers, but you can get lost in the shadow rabbit hole, so to speak, of more and more, you know. And I remember Sri Aurobindo from Integral Yoga also criticized that kind of pure psychological approach when it's not matched with also more spiritual practice.
It's about anchoring the divine.
Anchoring the divine and connecting to your essence, your true self. And there's also many parts needs to be integrated as part of our shadow, like we mentioned it, even Carl Jung at the beginning of this podcast in his quote about integrating it to become a whole. But there are aspects also that need to be rejected as not part of your true self, your true essence. And that can be, it's very tricky because you don't want to fall into the trap of suppressing, right? But there's also denial, but there's a process of rejecting certain aspects that are not part of your shadow, not part of your true self and essence, and are actually not part of your, suppressed nature, so to speak. But let's go into the second hour. I also talk about more how occult and entity interferences relate to shadow projections and triggers.
Yeah, and just an example about like rejection, for instance. Like I remember like something happened when I got off the airplane the other day and I got a little bit annoyed about something. And I was just like, no, I'm not gonna, it's just my first time seeing you in like a month. I was like, I'm not gonna bother with this, like that's the thing, is like this healthy ability to let go when necessary and realize like I find that especially a majority of humans, like the term I would use for them is like pettiness, especially in relationships. Like there's so much pettiness that goes on in relationships. Like people get mad about somebody not texting them back within an adequate amount of time, and it's like just like constant pettiness because of all these unresolved wounds or whatever within them that's driving the relationship. But, I think that's also kind of the positive aspect of rejection, is like once you work on yourself to a certain extent, you're like, no, I'm not going to I want to just focus on like our connection and love. And,
exactly.
That's also about focusing on your true essence and not getting involved in these like, just minute things as well.
The subtle art of not giving a fuck sometimes, this book by Mark Hansen.
Exactly.
It reminds me of you made a great analogy about meditating on death.
Oh, yeah, exactly. That's what I did. I actually applied that. So, yeah, I posted this on Facebook the other day, like one of the, basic Buddhist reflections. I think it's in like they call it the 4 reminders in Tibetan Buddhism. And one of them is to meditate on death, and it's so that you value your life and you don't waste it. And I think that's the most important aspect of it. So when you truly value your life and you live each, like I would say even hour, but each day at least as if it's your last, it completely changes how you treat your human relationships around you. You're not, I think a lot of people, and especially anyone who hasn't encountered like any sudden death in their life, even people who have, like they're like, oh, I'll just deal with that tomorrow or whatever. I'll like, I'll do what I really want to do after I retire in 5 years or whatever. It's always about like putting more time and more time.
Yeah. So basically, it's how would I really truly react to this situation, this person, if I would die in an hour, or he or she would,
Yeah, because I faced that recently when I didn't hear back from you, and you were about to call me, and you usually do, and you were driving somewhere, and that was a very spiritual experience for me, because I was like, I remember we were like doing some process earlier, and then what happened is I had this fear arise, which calmed down. Shortly after, I was able to feel into it intuitively. I knew that nothing happened, but this fear arose. I was like, oh my God, what if he got in an accident or whatever? And I realized that like nothing that we had been processing really mattered as much. And then it was able to help me refocus. So that was like a very important teaching in that moment. I think it was almost like, I feel like it was also like a divine grace in a sense, because it changed everything for me to really feel that in that moment. That's
a good example of what I just mentioned, to also bring the spiritual aspect into this process.
Yeah.
Right? The higher vision, your soul, the divine, and all of that.
Yeah. So just a few more notes. So in the second podcast episode, we're going to talk about a little bit more about, reclaiming the power in the shadow, how to process triggers in a relationship, how triggers relate to trauma, this collective shadow, and how it plays out in politics. Also, these occult forces and how they feed off this emotional leash based on our triggered responses, and maybe just go more into some practical tips for processing triggers and a bunch of other stuff. So yeah, if you want to listen to the second hour, please join the Piercing the Veil of Reality community. And there's a second hour of all our podcasts on there. And then also, once again, we're doing a monthly Zoom call, which is going to start tomorrow, Saturday, May 17th at 18th, Saturday, May 18th at 3 p.m. PST, and the link will be posted on the announcement section of the forum. So hope to see some of you there. And
so that Zoom call is also for the members,
yeah.
And you can sign up the whole membership. Also, we have a great forum over there, and there's amazing discussions and going deep into various topics.
Yeah, the forum is really active. Actually.
It's really active. It's nice. At veilofreality.com, you can check out everything over there and sign up to the membership. So hopefully see you in the second hour.